Hello and welcome to the 3D Blu-ray Bunker. This is a place where we look exclusively at 3D Blu-rays, not to review the film, but to almost entirely focus on the various aspects of the 3D, with just a very short comment at the end about the film itself. And today we're looking at the 2016 Star Wars film, Rogue One. Like I think every single live-action film under the Disney umbrella, this is a post-converted effort rather than being natively filmed in 3D. I think some of the nicer 3D shots in the film come quite early on. So, for example, the planet's ring system here is nice and pronounced, which obviously means a massive stereo base rather than a realistic view, something that I almost always prefer in terms of enjoyable 3D. And also on a planetary scale, these massive cosmic clouds look excellent, full of depth and solidity, and another piece of really nice hyperstereo. Narrowing the interaxial but still giving us a hugely exaggerated 3D view is this shot of a Star Destroyer, although even the bow of this ship sits entirely behind the screen, but there is a load of depth in the shot and the whole thing looks very nice. In the Disney trilogy films, there were shots of Star Destroyers that had the same sort of 3D volume as this one, but they decided to have a bit more fun with those and pop them away out of the screen for much more of a 3D thrill. About the same sort of depth is given to this city view, where there's a clear separation and depth in between the buildings, so this looks quite nice. And I like the way that they place the Death Star out in front of the background above the planet here. Another unrealistically wide view that I'm glad they decided to use. On the whole, though, I think 3D thrills are in pretty short supply in this film. Having had those earlier ultra-wide 3D shots, one of the views that I think would have looked great as a hyperstereo, but isn't shown that way, is this detailed city view. It's actually not especially impressive here. It feels like the conversion is almost a little bit half-hearted, not just for a lack of depth, but it just doesn't seem to me like a great deal of effort was made to separate out every element. So from a 3D point of view, this shot's a bit of a letdown. And speaking of letdowns, I actually think that there are quite a few of them in the film. What I mean by that is there are several scenes where I think there were opportunities for some great 3D, but they just weren't taken. As always, I have to acknowledge that I'm sure that the director, Gareth Edwards, captured his vision on film the way he wanted, but I definitely think he shot this basically entirely from a 2D point of view with little consideration for how to optimise it as a 3D experience. So, for example, something Star Wars has been doing since we were enthralled by R2-D2's projection of Princess Leia back in 1977 is holograms. They're an absolute mainstay of Star Wars films, popping up all over the place. If you've seen a hologram, you know that its most impressive quality is that it's three-dimensional. So I'd have thought that if you're putting a hologram in a 3D film, then it's worth capitalising on that fact, but not here. I mean, you can see depth through these holograms to the background beyond, but the holograms themselves look as good as flat. Also, when you've got a character perched somewhere high up, the view looking down on them with the 3D emphasising the danger they're in is, I think, a pretty obvious thing to show. So these guys here are navigating what looks like a fairly treacherous narrow cliff-top path, but we never get that view looking down on them. Similarly, when someone's climbing a ladder, especially when it's a really long ladder, I think it's a good idea to point the camera down at them so we can see how dangerous their climb is. But again, we never get that shot. Maybe they didn't think that the cliff-top walk or the ladder climbing was sufficiently dangerous to give us that 3D view to make us feel the peril. But if you've got a character desperately clinging to the edge of something over a massive drop, then surely that's supposed to be a moment of peril worth using 3D to do what it's brilliant at. But no view down here either. In fairness, there's another similar moment in the film where we do get a top-down view, but it's just not done all that well, so it isn't as impressive as it could have been. I think because we're too far away from the character. Like I say, I'm referring to these as missed opportunities, but I'm sure that every one of these suggestions would be quite reasonably and correctly dismissed by the director as the ramblings of a fool. So fair enough, but I maintain that that's because he was shooting a 2D film. Maybe the example of what I'm calling missed opportunities that I found most disappointing is this. Here's one of cinema's great villains, and this film takes place whilst he was still going through his villainous phase, and he's often been seen jabbing his finger at people. So we get that shot here, but I think it would have been great to get this as a point of view shot from Krennic, so the famous Vader finger jab could have been aimed at the audience and come out of the screen in an enjoyably menacing way. Or there's the classic hyperspace jump through a tunnel of blue light. Whilst the ship here is in 3D space in front of the light, we don't see any nice 3D effect in the tunnel itself. There's an incredibly brief moment, like a handful of frames only, when we see the star streaks in a good 3D view, but it's over and done with much too quickly to enjoy. There's a simple view in 3D films that I always like, and that's where the plane of the ground stretches out in front of us, and that view's done well a couple of times as we move across the ground into the distance. I quite like the depth that they've put in during this opening scene where a young Jin is hiding. It's pretty effective at showing the physical and emotional distance between her and her parents, and it's one of the moments in the film where I think the 3D is genuinely beneficial from a storytelling point of view. There is some other stuff that I thought was quite good, like some of the framing did actually look like it perhaps may have been done with some thought for shaping up a nice 3D view. Like here, you can tell from the 2D still that this ought to look good in 3D, and I think it does. And this is the same sort of thing, nicely framed and with some good depth, which all feels nicely appropriate here as the 3D helps to bring out the feeling of being enclosed, locked up in a cell. I think the best of these well-framed views is this shot as we move in towards someone beyond the figure in the cloak. Because we know who it is waiting deep in the screen, this is a fairly ominous moment, and I think the composition and depth here does a good job of setting that up. I love this fella's massive interocular, and it would have been fun to get a point of view shot from him with his super strong 3D view of the world, but I completely accept that there would have been no legitimate reason to do this. There's a fun piece of pop-out when a rock flies through space and out of the screen. It makes you wish for that asteroid belt in Empire Strikes Back to be in 3D. There are some binoculars which look pretty nifty, and the view through them has a just perceptible amount of 3D. It's barely noticeable, but there is a tiny bit of stereo space in the view through these binoculars. But weirdly, when we see Cassian aiming his sniper rifle, he closes one eye to look through his telescopic side, and there's a similar amount of 3D depth in the view he sees through the scope, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but what the hell, maybe things work differently in this galaxy. There are some views through windows that work quite well, like looking back at Jin here is quite nice, or the view out of a spaceship's window in the rain has a nice amount of depth to it. There are a few moments where debris blasts up and towards us, sometimes done reasonably well with quite nice separation between the elements, like this ultra brief moment here. I think it's not done so well here when a spaceship crash lands and throws up a lot of debris. It looks a bit messy to me here, and it's dark of course and very brief. You might think I'm being a bit nitpicky by complaining about these sort of things being brief, but there's always the option to use slow motion, which is a great friend of 3D, and keep in mind that this is the film where one explosion makes its incredibly leisurely way across the landscape, giving the gang plenty of time to run out of a building and climb into their escape vehicle, all in real time, whilst the explosion seems to be operating in a completely different time frame. So when I said that I don't think Gareth Edwards was all that interested in filming this to look good in 3D, I don't just mean by the way he chose not to include what I think would have been fairly obvious 3D views within scenes where they would have been entirely fitting, but his whole shooting style here just isn't good for 3D. This is a gritty war film with lots of handheld camera work, not as shaky as some, but still a bit wobbly for good 3D. And also there's a cinematic look with shallow depth of field in the focusing a lot of the time, again not really helpful for the most part with 3D. And quite a lot of the film is set in dark locations, which can be another enemy of effective 3D. Add to all of that the fairly quick editing, not super rapid fire maybe, but mostly a bit too fast for good 3D. Obviously it's Star Wars, so there are guns. It's a rare 3D film that features guns and doesn't pop them out of the screen, so we do get some of those views here, but as is often the case, the guns are out of focus, so I didn't think these are particularly good examples of the 3D pop gun shot. There's a big space battle where the 3D isn't really very effective. Most of the views in this part of the film are quite long shots without much strong 3D. They also feature fast-moving action, quick camera moves and fast cutting, none of which help what little 3D effect has been captured. This is a view that could have looked excellent as the design of these beams is ripe for a good 3D view, but it's all over in a split second and just not very impressive. The best 3D views during the space battle are probably the in-cockpit shots of the pilots, so not especially exciting, but the 3D here works quite well. The space planes look best when they're close in the foreground, and then we get to feel the depth beyond them a bit, but it's not classic stuff. Occasionally we get a view from on board a spaceship as if the pilot had stuck a GoPro on the outside of his ship to post a clip on YouTube, and these are the flying shots that I think work the best. Down on the ground in the thick of the battle it's even less impressive. Lots of foliage in this setting, which they didn't really have a hope of converting into good 3D. More fast action and fast cutting, nothing really interesting 3D wise. I think one of the the film's most effective pieces of 3D is when we see the Death Star's laser firing up, and this is a nice view with a load of depth to it, and a similar sort of effect is seen in what I think is by far the film's best use of 3D. I'd actually say this is the only part of the film where the 3D is especially impressive, and just for a moment it really does make you sit up and appreciate it. And it's this view of the place that the heroes have to get to save the day. The views up and the views down are great, stretching away deep into the screen. Now, I don't claim to know the first thing about the complexities of converting 2D to 3D, but that's not going to stop me offering up my ill-informed opinion, which is that I think that this was a relatively easy view to convert. It's nice and static, nothing moving in the frame, and it's got a linear, uninterrupted progression of depth. I'm not saying that a left and right eye view could be extracted as easily as pressing Ctrl-Shift 3D, but I do think that this would have been much more straightforward than most of the film's other shots. And another reason I think that is because this is such a standout shot in the film. None of the other 3D really comes anywhere close to matching the power of this shot. And they finally give us that view that I was complaining about being absent earlier, and that's the shot down on the people that we care about in an extremely dangerous position. So a very quick word about the film itself. I'm one of those people who regard this as clearly the third best Star Wars film, after the original two, of course. I recall this being sold as a standalone film set in the Star Wars universe, but what it actually is a great prequel to the original film, and I think it's maybe cinema's best example of a prequel, actually. It's a good enough story without any baggage, and it's brave enough to leave most of the characters in a state that's not typical of this sort of film. Maybe those characters were one of the weaker things in the film. They didn't feel all that fleshed out to me, but on the plus side, I thought it had the best Star Wars robot since R2-D2 and C-3PO, and actually K2SO was my favourite character in the film. Maybe it overreached a bit with a couple of CGI characters, but I suppose that that's a technology whose time had come, even if it still required some fine-tuning. I really like the way Gareth Edwards did something a bit different with this film, and I wonder if the experience he had making it took it out of him a little bit, as he doesn't seem to have been active since. He always came across as a really nice bloke, and I hope he's doing well and that he reappears with another film before too long. So, a good film, but not an especially noteworthy piece of 3D. Overall, I thought the 3D was mostly, at best, adequate, but only managing to be actively thrilling on one occasion. So I regard it as a sort of workmanlike conversion, and not one of Stereo D's better efforts, and definitely not demo material. So I hope you found this in some way useful, and if so, I hope you'll join me again soon for another 3D Blu-ray review. Until then, thanks for looking on this one, cheers for now, bye bye.